Hello, everyone. My name is Alice McLaughlin, and I am Vice Provost and Dean of Graduate Studies here at York University. It's my tremendous pleasure to welcome all of you to our latest event in the Scholarly Skills Series, which focuses on the use of generative AI, generative artificial intelligence, in graduate research. This is obviously a hot topic for just about everyone in higher education. I mean, quite possibly everyone in the world these days. And I think there are particular questions for graduate researchers and other early career researchers who are very much at the beginning of their research careers and also play a really pivotal role in the research ecosystem. And also, let's face it, are the first generation of scholarly researchers to be coming up from the beginning in an age of AI. So I am really excited to be facilitating this conversation with all of you today. I want to say off the bat, my role very much is facilitator and guide. I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of experts whom I will be introducing you to shortly to help me start to figure out some of the do's, don'ts, and ongoing discoveries of generative AI, and hopefully you as well. But before I do, and because this is a virtual webinar and we are coming together, I guess appropriately, given the topic, in virtual space, I want to start by taking a moment to acknowledge the land that York is on. And while I do so, I want to invite all of you to take a moment to reflect on the history of the place and space that you are joining us from today. So I will start in a good way with York's land acknowledgement. York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located. These precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So thank you, all of you, from whether you're at York, on campus in those lands, or anywhere else in Turtle Island or around the world. Thank you for joining us today. And it's my tremendous pleasure to introduce you to some of the people I will be speaking with today in order to help us puzzle through this topic. So I'd like to introduce you to today's panelists, starting first with Emily Kwong, who is an assistant professor in electrical engineering and computer science here at York. And she also runs the COCO, Co-Designing Collaborations with AI Lab, which is part of the Graphics and Media at York Hub. I should add also that in addition to being one of our top AI researchers at York, she is a doctoral supervisor who is available and welcoming new graduate students. So please keep that in mind if this is an area of research that's of interest to you. In addition to Professor Kwong, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Regina Rini, who is the Canada Research Chair in Moral and Social Cognition and an associate professor in the philosophy department and graduate philosophy program here at York University. Thank you so much, Gina, for joining us. I should add that one of Gina's many research specializations focuses on the ethics and societal implications of artificial intelligence. And finally, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Robin Sutherland Harris. Dr. Sutherland Harris is an educational developer here at York's Teaching Commons, and she also leads the Generative AI Pedagogies community of practice at York. So it's wonderful to have three people whose work intersects so closely and so differently with questions of generative AI in scholarly research, in pedagogy, and in higher education. So thank you so much for joining us. Just to give you a quick overview of today's webinar, we'll start by hearing a little bit from me and some of the work I've done creating guidelines for graduate students at York when it comes to thinking through and thinking about how to incorporate or not AI into your research, whether that's for classroom coursework, for key academic milestones, or in your dissertation or thesis research and beyond. I will then invite Robin to present some broader considerations about generative AI and authorship more generally. And then I'm going to open things up to the whole panel and ask them some questions, the kind of questions I have or that I know I would have if a graduate student came to me and said, I want to incorporate AI into my work. And frankly, I'll just put this on the table. If that happened, the first thing I would do was call Gina. So I'm very glad that I can bring her today for this webinar. But I want to remind our experts, all three of you, but particularly Emily and Gina, who has come in a little bit later, that this is very much not a scholarly talk by me, but a conversation. And if you want to jump in at any time, you are more than welcome. At the end, we'll provide some further resources, and we'll also, I hope, with time, open things up a little bit to questions and answers from the audience. If you have a question, a comment, or a concern, the best way to get it to us is to put it in the chat, and someone from the webinar will read it out. Hopefully, we'll get to all of them. We can't make any promises, but we'll do our best. So thank you so much. And let's hope that all of us can get clear on some of the key guidelines, decision procedures, bigger ethical and philosophical questions, and scholarly tips for approaching what is an exciting new tool, a terrifying transformation, the end of life as we know it, depending on your perspective, and see where we can go. So I want to start a little bit by talking through some of the guidelines that are currently available from the Faculty of Graduate Studies that I and some others worked on last year to help you think about being a graduate student at York when it comes to generative AI. So these guidelines are pan-university. They cross all disciplines. And I mention this because this means they are necessarily broad, or if you're feeling more critical, a little bit vague. They're also intended to be flexible given the changing nature of the technology, as well as cultural and disciplinary norms when it comes to AI in higher ed. They are organized very much around what the broader AI group at York took to be the key principles that should inform how we think about new technologies. These are the principles of transparency, technological literacy, in this case, AI literacy, choice, academic integrity, and alignment with York's core values. And these include values of scholarly excellence, diversity and inclusion, and socially engaged research. But basically, what this comes down to, the key consideration is to always remember that you, as a graduate student research, are responsible for and accountable for the work you produce and the techniques, research, methods, and sources you draw on to produce that research. And I think if you remember that you remain the locus of responsibility and accountability, you will stay more or less on the right track. By the way, if you're interested in knowing more about these guidelines, they are available on the Faculty of Graduate Studies website, and I believe the link is going in the chat. So we organize these around 4 points: the need for open dialogue between student and supervisor, the need to continue best citation practices, to be aware of risks, and to be very aware of your disciplinary norms, because I promise you they are very different than everyone else's disciplinary norms. So first point, if you are thinking about using AI, if you have been using AI, if you want to use AI, talk to your supervisor, talk to your supervisory committee if you have one. If they're not really sure, or your supervisor is like, oh, I don't know about this AI stuff, talk to your graduate program director or experts in your discipline about what are the best practices in your field for incorporating this tool. Don't just have this conversation once, continue to check in about your usage of it, how you're using it, how you're documenting it. And ultimately, remember, the goal is, looking at these principles, transparency. And that means at every stage, you should be ready to explain, to account for, to justify, to discuss the use of AI in the work that you have produced. Now, I know explain, account for, justify can sound very negative, but remember, this is something we do when it comes to our scholarly work all the time. When at a thesis defense, when your examining committee asks you questions, you are explaining yourself, you are accounting for your conclusions, you are justifying your methods, you are citing your sources. So that principle of transparency and the ability to be accountable for your use is crucial in that. And so the best way to do that is to have open dialogue, to make sure that those who are guiding you are aware of it and are making sure that you are following appropriate practices in keeping to that transparency. And of course, the main method for transparency brings us to the second box, and that's citation. Pay attention to how and when generative AI was used in your research. Be sure to document and cite it appropriately as you would any other approach or methodological tool. Keep in mind that different citation tools now include guidance for AI, and that may be useful to you for ways of regularly documenting and accounting for. And so that will allow you to live up to the principle of transparency in both your written work and in any oral presentation of it. Now, so that's all sort of thinking about it as a tool. But now I want to broaden it a little bit and say, be aware of the risks in using AI. Now, there are risks to using anything. If you think about it, if you choose one source and not another, you are in some sense placing trust in that author. I've never read a book where I checked every single claim that was made in it. So there are always risks in doing research because it's a collaborative, knowledge is a collaborative shared project. Knowledge production is a collaborative shared project. But over the years, and by years I do mean centuries, we have gotten used to engaging in that collaboration with other human agents. And now we are being invited to think about new forms of collaboration. And there are new risks associated with the use of AI. These include scholarly risks that you may fall afoul of your disciplinary norms, that you may go wrong in a way that you didn't understand or didn't intend. You'll hear about some of this in a slide from Robin about AI and authorship. These can include intellectual property risks or risks to your data, questions of data sovereignty, what you're putting into an AI engine, what you have permission to put into an AI engine if you are working with, for example, human participants. If you are putting other people's data into an AI engine, you may need to find out if you have permission to do it or what will happen to it when it goes in. Questions of privacy, data contamination, and there are ethical risks you need to be aware of. There has been a lot of work describing potential implicit bias. Again, I don't like the sort of attribution error here. There has been discussion of how human implicit bias may get picked up and replicated in the tools we create, so that there is a danger of implicit bias in some of what AI generates as well. I'm not listing these as these are all the reasons AI is bad, but this is why it's important to go in with an informed understanding and to start to develop a sense of what kinds of risks you can mitigate or not, what kinds of risks you're prepared to take on, and how you are appropriately and responsibly communicating those risks to your collaborators, including participants in any work with human participants you're doing or others in your collaboration. You may also want to consider broader ethical questions, such as the environmental impact of generative AI, and views on this range widely, as do accounting of what its environmental impact is, as well as questions of intellectual property and the use of human, artistic, or scholarly work in creating data for AI engines. For those of you who are putting together ethics forms as part of your thesis or dissertation proposal, this is a crucial place to start to identify and reflect on some of these risks and to account for how you are approaching, documenting, and mitigating them. And then the last point is disciplinary norms. Be aware of what the norms are in your field. And so by that, I mean your subject area. Like, are you working in English? Are you working in electrical engineering? Are you working in anthropology or philosophy or cinema studies? Each of these scholarly disciplines, are you working in an interdisciplinary field that may draw on all of them? And the kinds of scholarly venues that you're looking at may be in one field or another. You're going to need to know what the disciplinary norms for AI are, because these vary widely. For example, there are still some leading publications in many disciplines that require you to check off a box saying no AI was used in the research leading to this submission. If that's something that may come up in your discipline, you may need to think about that if you are planning to publish part or all of your doctoral or master's research afterwards. There are others where it's very normal and very understood that people would indeed draw on AI in their research. And then the question is, what does your intended venue have in the way of AI policies? And how might your decisions early in your research, when it's your student research, affect the possibilities and potentialities of publication, promotion, dissemination, knowledge mobilization later? So those are the guidelines that's available on York's website. But actually, I don't want to draw your attention to York's website. I'm going to draw your attention to another university's website, because I think they have a really nice decision tree. And I want to make you aware of it. I have found it a helpful tool, and I have passed it on to other students. This is something from the University of Windsor. They've made it clear that it's free to share. And they, in fact, acknowledge our website as well as other university websites in how they put it together. So you can see Ontario universities are figuring this out together. So the University of Windsor has a decision tree, and the link is at the bottom of the page and is going to be put in the chat. You'll see the actual decision tree is much more complicated than this. I've broken it down, but it basically helps you think through each step when and how to use AI. And so they say the first thing is to ask, have you talked to your supervisor and gotten their approval? If not yet, that's what you need to do before moving forward. Um, if yes, and they say it's fine, then go forward. If they say no, and then I think you know the answer and you have to sit down and talk about it. Now, I'll be honest, the answer isn't sort of give up forever. It might be to have further conversations, it might be to understand why they say no. Is this something about your discipline or is it a personal thing for them? And you might even need to ask, is this going to be a methodological mismatch? That means this isn't the right supervisor, or you need to start thinking about how to accommodate or adjust and so on. But that's the first conversation to have. The next is a policy check. Have you checked whether the university, your department, your faculty, whatever it is you're doing this for, has a policy about using AI for this type of task? Could be coursework, could be a particular kind of research, maybe it's data analysis, maybe it's a literature review. Are there policies that say this is or isn't allowed? And are you following them? So those are the first two. But then the third one is to invite you to think, like, what is the task that you are asking AI to do? And is this an appropriate use of AI? Because there are some uses of AI that are academic integrity guidelines. And I think, frankly, our own sense of ourselves and our work as scholars tell us that we know it's inappropriate to use. So, for example, generating substantial sections of your entire text through AI is not an appropriate use. You are the author. You need to be doing that. Generating core ideas, arguments, hypotheses without any of your own intellectual labor or input, letting it do the work rather than using it for yourself to do the work. Submitting completely AI generated work as your own for publication. Using AI for deception in some kind. Any use that violates academic integrity or student code of conduct. Those are not appropriate uses. And so that's a sign to stop. But there are other uses that might be proceed with caution. You might need to use a high level of care, verification, ongoing conversations with your supervisor, checking in on disciplinary norms. And these would include debugging, optimizing code, generating synthetic data, coding or thematic analysis of qualitative data, um, recording and transcribing interviews with consent. These sorts of things, I would suggest you talk to your supervisor about it, talk to others about it, find out what the norms are in your field, reflect on how you're doing it, the care you're taking, the work you're putting in, and so on. And then there are uses of AI that at this point in December 2025 are more and more considered generally acceptable. Again, as long as you are following principles of transparency, disclosure, citation, and so on. So, for example, brainstorming ideas, refining a research question you yourself have generated that you're not quite happy with, improving the clarity of your writing or seeking feedback, checking grammar and style. These sorts of things are generally more accepted. And as long as you are, again, prepared to be transparent, checking in with your supervisor, you can proceed. So those are the first three. But then this Windsor spreadsheet says, it's also, that's not the end of the check. That sort of tells you that your purposes are, in some sense, legitimate and that you have double checked with the appropriate authorities. But as a researcher, you are also the steward of data. And you are also, there are risks to you in terms of data security and privacy. And so they suggest doing a data security and privacy check. Are you inputting unpublished research results into the AI, confidential or sensitive data for human participants, copyrighted or personal information? So do some research to understand what kinds of privacy or data security risks you might be engaging in. Know which AI engine you're using, what their policies around personal or sensitive information are, whether that information gets taken up and used in other ways, where it goes, how it belongs. These are things to understand in advance. Again, as part of being a responsible and accountable researcher. Then accountability and verification check. Are you prepared to critically evaluate, fact check, and verify what you get from the AI for concerns around accuracy, bias, and completeness? In other words, are you prepared to treat the AI output as the starting point and not the final result of what you're going to take and incorporate into your research? And I think that's I'm sure many of you know this from your own work as TAs. This is sometimes someplace where undergrads or other students go wrong, assuming they've gotten the answer and all they have to do is take it instead of engaging critically as they would with any other interlocutor or source and saying, how can I use this? What can I take from it? What do I need to double check? Again, it's that taking responsibility and being accountable. And then finally, and important from York's values, is the transparency check. Are you prepared to document and cite the use of the AI tool in your work according to set academic standards? Are you following the specific guidelines of your program, faculty, our academic integrity guidelines, or of the publisher or discipline as well? And so I quite like this as a decision process for thinking about how to approach AI generally and how to be aware of ways in which you might go wrong, while also allowing for the possibility that there are legitimate uses of it that can enhance, expedite, make more efficient, or broaden the kind of research that you, as an early career researcher at a university without an unlimited budget, can do. So it allows us to proceed with cautions in ways that are still open to the possibilities. So that was my introduction, which is very much, admittedly, from a decanal, from a sort of authorities perspective, thinking administratively about how to make sure that people don't go wrong. But that can be that's a very particular top-down perspective. And for the rest of this session, I want to open things up a little bit to thinking more broadly about some of the conceptual and ethical questions, and then also more practically in terms of sort of what to ask, how to go about it, how to approach it. And so I'm going to turn things over to Robin Sutherland Harris for a little bit before we open up to the panel as a whole. Robin, I'll just move things onto your slide.
Thank you so much. So this slide is really, I guess, a way of getting us thinking about where we currently stand with how generative AI might be reshaping or influencing ideas of authorship in a scholarly context. This sort of is the result of a kind of lit review that was in part conducted with the use of an AI tool, which is something I'm happy to talk more about. But I think that can be I don't know, I find it a useful starting point in a lot of places to begin with something like that, not to end with it, as Alice was saying. So the first point I think that is important to recognize is that an AI cannot be an author in our sort of current understanding of what a scholarly author is. As far as I know, I have not yet encountered an academic publisher that will accept a large language model as a co-author. This maybe will change in the future, who knows? But as far as I've seen, all of them so far requiring a human author to maintain accountability for the scholarship that's at play. And I think this is really important. Part of the reason why this has happened, or why this is sort of, I guess, a kind of line in the sand right now, is that there's this idea of a kind of moral agency that is required by the author. So if you are taking on the sort of position as the author, you have the moral authority of that kind of stance. And because of the way generative AI works, it draws on this sort of large body of data information that's kind of all mushed together. The scholars Islam and Greenwood have called this a hypercommons. It's very difficult within that to trace exactly where a specific idea is coming from, and therefore it's difficult to kind of cite that, or to give reference and acknowledgement and appropriate scholarly attribution to where ideas and concepts are coming from, using the sort of the way that the generative AI is just kind of pulling on this hypercommons. So that is part of why the AI itself is actually not able to take on that position of moral agency and responsibility. This is also kind of what leads us into the importance of transparency, right? So you may have used AI, it may have drawn on that hypercommons, but if you have used it in an appropriate and responsible way, that can be fine. And sort of state of the field in terms of what most publishers are doing in terms of scholarly publishing is, there's a disclosure component. So an AI can be used But you as the sort of human author need to take responsibility for it, and you need to disclose exactly how it is being used. This might happen in an introduction. It might be part of your methods section. It might be an appendix. You might be doing it through a citation process. Things will differ across different disciplines and in different journals. Um, and I guess there are also some practical implications here around what generative AI can do for us in the landscape of scholarly authorship and research. It can offer some support for the writing process. It can do some of the sort of heavy lifting of the sort of slog of academic writing, and allow authors to shift maybe more attention to the sort of, hopefully, the critical, analytical, creative sort of aha moments of the scholarly process, and maybe less energy spent on the kind of proofreading, editing, getting things exactly right in terms of formatting, that kind of stuff. Um, However, at the same time, there's definitely a risk if we're looking at very widespread use of generative AI across a discipline or a field, that there's the potential risk of a reduction in the overall quality or innovation of scholarly work, partly because of the way generative AI operates as a kind of engine that is looking for what is most statistically probable in its outputs. It kind of has some natural limitations on truly like amazingly innovative kind of frontier knowledge creation. And then I think finally, there are some kind of points to consider around sort of philosophical or broadly conceptual shifts in our sense of what it means to be an author when we're in this sort of AI informed or AI infused landscape. Do these reduced barriers to scholarly authorship, which sort of might encompass some of the specialized knowledge and skills that we have sort of taken the time to acquire, suggest that we should be re-emphasizing or emphasizing to a greater degree the importance of human creativity and novelty instead. And then in addition, the sort of potential large-scale challenge of deep fakes in the research landscape. And I think also I would add to this now the sort of concern around the influence of AI in the scholarly publishing kind of pipeline and procedure, and the way that there's a risk for, I think, in the sort of publishing, journal review, peer review kind of process. Hopefully there will be some protection against peer review that has been produced by AI as well. So I think that's part of the sort of philosophical question or big picture question around this sort of scholarly landscape and research space.
Thank you. Lots to think about there. I am going to open things up to the panel. I have a lot of questions, but I've realized I think the first thing I want to say is to Emily and Gina, is there anything that you're just dying to add to what we've said so far? Is there something that was provoked or you want to maybe take issue with or comment on in the presentation so far? I know you both have thought a lot in very different ways about AI in higher ed, in research, and in graduate research in particular. So I want to start by just giving you a chance to speak. Maybe starting with you, Gina?
Sure. And thanks for having me here. It's interesting to talk about this stuff. I would add just one thing, not disagreeing with what's been said, but I think it's a complication, which is the idea that generative AI only recycles existing content. That's a standard way of thinking about it, but I think there's a complication here, which is that because generative AI is stochastic, meaning it mirrors statistical patterns, and it builds upon prior rare events in its own output. So if you're reading along a ChatGPT transcript, if it's a long one, there are small random events that happen in there because of the stochastic distribution. And when you start compounding random events, you can actually get down a trail of text that has never existed before in any human text ever, which is, it's not unusual. It's not what normally happens, but it partly explains why you can get complete nonsense or lies or fake information. And it also explains how large language models and other generative AI can actually be creative, which is weird. And so I just wanted to sort of flag that possibility. It can be really
Mhm.
beneficial to research that's meant to be creative, but it's also really dangerous because then you have the situation where if you're trying to attribute the material, it's not just the problem we've talked about already, where you're attributing the material to the hypercommons and to an unknown human author. There is actually no human author. And that's very hard. That's unprecedented. We don't really know how to attribute ideas to the lack of a human author. So that's anyway, I just want to flag that as
I
a
love
potential
that.
problem.
Thank you. And it's helpful because so much of how we even define what is creative or invented or new, or even think about concepts, and Gina and I have to be very careful not to slip into philosophy here, would tie it in some way to agency and authorship. So thank you for that. Thank you for so much. Emily, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, no, this has been a great discussion so far. And also, yeah, what Gina said was very interesting because that was something I was going to bring up as well, is that large language models are probability based, right? They predict next words. And so they could come up with, something that is new and novel, but it is based on, the existing data set that it has been trained on. And in terms of, authorship and ownership, again, I also agree with Robin that in my scholarly work, have not come across any conferences that allow, AI or large language models to be cited as co-author. So I would also just voice caution in using that in your scholarly work.
That's really helpful. And it's so helpful to hear two people who are so aware of the really exciting and even creative potentialities and possibilities of AI, also expressing caution in sort of how we step forward right now. There's that sense as the long run may be exciting, but the short run requires caution. And I appreciate that. So I want to start as a question with just something very basic. I know that all of you have people coming to you in different capacities, asking for advice and guidance about their work. What's the first thing or the first few things you tell a graduate student when they come to you excited to use generative AI in their dissertation research? And maybe we'll keep going with you, Emily, first, and then I'll just sort of move along the row.
Yeah, and my work, as you mentioned, my lab is about co-designing collaborations with AI. So my response is go for it. I've encouraged the use of AI both in my coursework, in my courses, as well as to my grad students for their research. But I also, I had this basically this form that they had to fill out, being like, how did you use this tool? Which tools did you use? And did you encounter any of these hallucinations and things that large language models are known, these known risks? And then how did you mitigate them? So, did you check an actual Google Scholar? Did you actually check a peer-reviewed paper? Did you check that the paper it said actually exists? Right? And then there's those mitigation strategies. And then lastly, I asked them to fill out a form basically saying, what did you learn from this experience? So
Mm-hmm.
I encourage, people to develop the skills of working with AI because, once you're out of school, you go into the company and the workforce, there's a lot of push towards, AI as your partner, as a collaborator to help increase efficiency in the workplace. So I think that it is very productive to teach students the skills to think critically about AI instead of, having policies of no AI use in coursework. So that's sort of my stance on it. And I usually encourage, students to use it, but definitely, um, explain to me how they used it, and then also to do that check, that reflection of like, is the output correct? So that's sort of my what I would suggest to students, and as a first step. And then when they come to me with specific issues that they encounter, then we can have a deeper discussion about how we address those issues.
Oh, that's helpful. Thank you. Nina, you're in a very different field, almost at the opposite end of the sort of humanities to science spectrum. How do you approach it when students come to you?
It depends on what they mean if they say they want to use AI. So if they want to study AI, like as a philosophical topic, because it's a reflection of human minds or the nature of language, or they want to think about the political and ethical impact, then I say, yes, you need to use AI. You need to be familiar with it. You need to have played with it a lot. You can't really comment on the societal implications of technology if you've not really used it yourself. If that's not what they're doing, if they're doing some standard philosophical topic and they're like, and I also want to use AI in the production of my research, then I'd be more skeptical. Because then we have to worry about what is it you're doing? Are you talking to the AI and getting to generate objections to your views about metaphysics? That might be okay. And I think this is going to come up more in our conversation, but you have to be much more careful. And to be honest, what I would say to a grad student right now is the norms around this are so unsettled that by the time you finish your dissertation, they may have shifted under you. That's risky. It's not that you can't
Mhm.
do it, it's just that it's very risky, and you might end up having to redo part of your research because the norms have changed in a certain way 3 years from now. So I would caution students who are not, if AI is not part of your subject matter, I would caution them to use it sparingly in the research production process right now.
That's helpful. Thank you. And Robin, I know you have everyone coming to you. So what do you tend to say when, say, early career researchers or graduate students come interested in using AI?
Well, it's a bit of a hypothetical for me because people come to me with questions about teaching and pedagogy much
Mhm.
more than they come to me with questions about research. Um, I think, though, that, in addition to what Gina was saying about, the sort of potential for the field to kind of shift under our feet over the next few years and to take a kind of cautionary approach there. And in addition, also to what you said earlier, Alice, with the sort of pipeline sort of or decision tree of like, talk to your advisor, think about what are the disciplinary norms, look at the funding agencies and the journals,
Yeah.
journals in your field, and see what their practices and standards are right now. I think another maybe really useful thing to do at this stage is to think about your own kind of learning and research and writing and revising processes and try to identify those moments or those places where you have your best, most exciting, most original kind of aha moments yourself and try to protect that space from the AI. So not necessarily don't use the AI, but try to figure out like where are your kind of, sparks flying and juices flowing. And that'll maybe be different for different people. Like some people really get that in discussion with colleagues. Some people, in the sort of initial brainstorming spurt or in a kind of revised, like they not so much in the initial stage, but then they do a sort of second pass, and that's where the big ideas come. Some people, it's in the actual process of writing or the process of editing their work where they get their really great ideas. And I think trying to protect that space that's your own intellectual territory where you feel like you're generating really great ideas is really valuable if you're thinking about where should AI fit? It should not fit in those spaces, I think.
Mhm.
It's also like such a wonderful feeling as a scholar, right? When you have those moments. And if AI, I think, can help you have more of those really like sort of deliciously crunchy intellectual moments that are really your own, that seems to me to be a good use for it, as long as you've sort of taken all those many other caveats into consideration.
I like that answer. Thank you. Okay, so I think in some ways, Emily and Gina, your answers to my last question have anticipated this, but I want to flip it around and ask the two of you as supervisors, what are some of the most common mistakes you see, graduate students or others, early career researchers, but what are the mistakes people tend to make when it comes to the use of AI or its avoidance? What are the things to watch out for? Maybe Gina first?
Yeah, so the most common mistake I've seen so far, pretty early on, is people thinking that because generative AI gives a citation for its claims, that means the citation is a real citation, or really, I mean, I think people nodding along with this. If you've done this and if you're familiar with this, a generative AI can just completely fabricate citations right down to like the DOI, the digital object, the reference thing you could use to click through. I've actually had somebody online once using generative AI to create their responses to an argument they were having with me. I think semi-transparently they would use a shtick, like I knew this person was doing this, and it generated a bunch of citations, and I followed them through. And yeah, these were just made up things that this person was presenting as evidence. They were empirical citations. Anyway, that's an example. I'm sure other people have experienced this, but I've realized some students don't realize this, that they think that if it looks like a citation, then it is. And so that's the number one thing, is like you have to click through, you have to go look at it yourself. You cannot assume there's editorial guidance on what kind of citations are being used in the way you could for a human authored product. So that's the number one problem I've seen students engage in. I'd say number two is just a question of how to properly explain what you've used it for. I mean, partly this is on all of us.
Yeah.
We don't really have clear norms yet for how to document the use of AI. But sometimes students will have a footnote where they say, "I used GPT," but they don't really say in what way. And
Mm.
that's not enough. They need more detail. But it is partly on us right now to establish the norms for what kind of detail they need. It's got to be something though. It can't just be "I use ChatGPT."
I like that a lot, needing to be descriptive and specific. Thank you. Emily, what about you?
Yeah, I was nodding along because I was going to say the exact same thing. It's fabricated references. I will tell an anecdotal story from one of my colleagues. He actually had a paper with a student that's rejected because the student actually used AI as part of their literature review, and all of the references, as he was doing just a glance of the reference list. They were real authors, they were real people, but AI combined real author names, people who've never published together, but real people, put them all as co-authors on a paper that didn't exist. But it looked real, right? And even the advisor, as he's a colleague professor, he looked through the reference list, everything looked fine, it did not look fake. Right, because these were real people who published in this area, but AI actually, combined different people as co-authors, and this paper did not exist. And so, yeah, that was a story that I heard about with a paper actually being desk rejected. And of course, he had to go have difficult conversation with his grad student about this issue, right? And I
Mhm.
definitely do not want to be in a situation as a graduate supervisor. So yeah, so that is one thing that I would just caution everyone against, double check your references. Reviewers will look through them now that they know that, AI is a thing. And the second thing I think is also just a lot of students still use like the general version of ChatGPT, but there's a lot of prompt engineering and prompt techniques that can actually increase your output, improve your output. Things like chain of thoughts, prompting, one shot, few shot. There are a lot of different strategies for prompting techniques that you can use to actually improve the outputs of the version of ChatGPT or general whatever copilot that you're using. And so I would encourage students to actually experiment with these different prompt engineering techniques to see if they can get better output from AI.
And where would students learn about these?
I mean, if you just go on the OpenAI website, they have
Right,
like
learn from
prompt
AI. Okay.
engineering, and also like Google has their, like most big companies have sort of their like prompt engineering guide, or if you just Google prompt engineering guide, there's going to be lots of, people for specific contexts. For example, if you work in like design, if you work in something else, they have tailored GPT versions for different specific tasks. So if maybe are open to experimenting with AI, you can look at, maybe some AI GPTs or customized versions of chatbots that can actually help you do the specific tasks that you're looking for, instead of just using the general version, of ChatGPT or Copilot.
That's really helpful. Listen, I have a million questions. I know that there are good questions coming up in the chat, but this last point I'm going to ask one last one myself before I open it up a little bit. And this is one that's really been on my mind as someone who thinks about graduate studies and the future of graduate studies more generally, as well as individual students. And that's a question of sort of research skills. So on the one hand, I just asked, like, how do students learn how to do this? What new skills should graduate students be developing in order to effectively use generative AI in their research? And then my flip question is, what skills do you think are in danger of being lost as we tend to focus more and more on AI as a tool? So I'm interested in both the what do we need to be gaining and what might we lose? I saw Gina nod, so I'll go to you first.
I'll start with the negative side and then do the positive side. So what am I worried people might lose? I think the skill of deep reading is really in danger. And that's because the technological affordances really are against it right now. If you open, at least in the version of Adobe Acrobat that I have, if you open any PDF right now, it always puts a stupid banner thing at the top that says, "This is a long document. Would you like the AI assistant to summarize it for you?" And I actually have been able to figure out how to make that go away permanently. You can exit out once, but it comes back every time I open Adobe Acrobat again. And that's very bad for scholarship, because if you get used to using AI summaries, you're going to increasingly lose the ability to check whether the AI summaries themselves are accurate. And if you don't
Mm-hmm.
have the foundation of being able to read a long document yourself and understand what a fair summary of it is, then you're not in the position to calibrate. And this is when I say that, people hear it as like a kind of AI doomer view, but that's not the point. The point is, if you've learned those skills once and you can do it yourself, then maybe you can start safely using AI to help you digest large documents, because you have the ability to go back and double check. But if you get used to never doing it at all, then you're not going to even have the capacity to double check clearly. And that I do worry about that. I genuinely worry that current PhD students who get used to this tool are going to fall into that trap. On the
That's a good
positive
point.
side, or do you want to go? Do you want to go to
No,
something
tell us the
back?
positive. Let's not end with your doomer side. Go for it.
Yeah. So on the positive side, in philosophy, I've seen other people do this, which is use a chatbot to help them think through the edges of an idea. So like, basically type a new idea into the chatbot and get back some objections. Usually the objections are predictable. That's more about like referee proofing. But every now and then I've seen people post clips of this on social media. They'll get back something that everybody reading this says, oh, I hadn't thought of that. The author hadn't thought about that. The people reading along hadn't thought about that. No one knows exactly how the chatbot came up with it. And that's really interesting. And we don't quite understand yet exactly if there's any predictable way to elicit responses like that. But if we learned how, then that would be really beneficial to creative research. So that's something I think graduate students are in a really good position to learn how to do, because they have it's almost always true. Graduate students are closer to the cutting edge of a discipline than anybody else in the discipline is. And so they're often in a position to be able to find new things. So that would be great if people can learn how to do that very effectively.
Thank you. That was more inspiring. I appreciate that. Emily, what about you?
So I come from a computer science background, and vibe coding is a thing now. It was coined in February of 2025, and so I think a lot of students are basically using AI to generate completely all of their coding assignments. Code you can generate websites with one prompt. And so I think that, one skill that I would, caution computer science students in particular is to still, you need to understand fundamental data structures, understand fundamental computer science concepts. How do you, the efficiency, the big O of your algorithms before just getting AI to generate all of your code. So I think that's one skill that I am scared of students, just using vibe coding or AI to generate all of their code. And then,
Yeah.
it just becomes, a lot of work debugging. And so you go from, being a developer to actually just debugging. And maybe you can use the AI to debug the AI as well, right? So then you actually lose that ability to think critically about the code that you're producing. And I think the positive side actually that I've used very recently or very like frequently is asking the AI to be my reviewers, right? I feel like this is sort of my idea. This is my study design. What can reviewers say about this or think of this from, the perspective of a reviewer? And so this actually, like similar to what Gina said, provides me with different perspectives that sometimes I may not have thought about in my own work, and that can help me shape, my study design, as well as to preempt, some of the things that real human reviewers will actually say to me in an actual peer review process.
I love the parallels here, two very different disciplines, but the idea of like still being able to deal with text or code on the one hand is so crucial, but learning how to treat AI as an interlocutor, a reviewer, a critic on the other can be so valuable. Robin, do you have anything to add to Oh, Gina, go ahead. Yeah. And then
Sorry, I just a brainwave. I appreciate you saying that, Alice, but also somebody once upon a time had a bit of a computer science background. I don't think it's an accident. I actually think that part of what it is to write code and to think about the ideas behind a philosophical project are at a very abstract level the same kind of project. And so I often actually recommend to philosophy students take one programming class just so you get used to seeing the shape of what it is to lay out an idea in that kind of explicit way. You don't have to go beyond that, but just getting some practice doing that, I think, is actually good for students in philosophy, probably across the humanities. So anyway, I just wanted
yeah.
to wave the flag for it. It's a good idea to do a little bit of programming.
I love that. And listen, that's very much in keeping with the sort of York's commitment to interdisciplinarity, but also the commitment to AI literacy. I think, at a very basic level, we can think about AI literacy, but maybe we need to be thinking about some of the literacy of the things that led to AI, and that would include sort of literacy in computer programming. So thank you for that. Robin, I'll give the last word to you, and then Debbie will be ready to open up for some questions from the floor briefly.
Thank you. I'm actually going to jump back to the previous question about common mistakes.
Oh, please do. Yes.
I do see a lot of people who are very new to using AI or are first starting to grapple with it. And I think this also kind of dovetails a little bit with a sort of skill set question as well for graduate students and everyone when they start engaging with AI is to be able to kind of navigate and engage with the sort of jagged frontier of AI technology. So the jagged frontier is a sort of idea put forward by Ethan Mollick, who's a very helpful thinker in the field of AI and education, if you haven't encountered him. And it's the idea that in some areas, the AI's capabilities are well ahead. They're quite advanced. They're very novel. They're going to impress the socks off you. And in other areas, they're lagging behind what the hype kind of has promised. And what happens for a lot of people who are new users of AI is they sort of test something out with an AI and they get one or the other of those sort of areas on the jagged frontier. They get something that is really impressive to them, where they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe the AI can do this. Or they get something that is very underwhelming to them. And then they sort of think that that is representative more broadly of what the AI can actually do. So I think that's something to, I don't know, learn how to navigate, learn how to kind of work around when you start using an AI, is just, recognizing and being aware of it. It may be able to do one thing well. That doesn't necessarily mean it can do all the things well, or that you should trust it in similar cases. So it's a very kind of fluid landscape. So I think that is one of the things that is a skill set. It's also a common mistake I see people sort of, land somewhere on that frontier and they get really enthusiastic and it's kind of out of proportion, or they just dismiss the whole thing. And that also is maybe not a totally accurate approach. And then Gina, I also just wanted to like re-emphasize what you were saying about the potential sort of loss of the skill of deep reading, and the risk of over-reliance on AI summaries. I saw some recent research that specifically talks about position bias in AI technology. So if you're asking AI for a summary, it's going to overemphasize the content that is at the beginning and the end of a longer document, and sort of like flip through, or sort of like not really do justice to the stuff that's in the middle, which of course, as we know from like writing scholarly articles and research, there's a lot of really important stuff that happens in those middle sections that's not in the intro and the conclusion. And it makes sense that AI is doing that, because that's also a lot of how humans write summaries of things, often kind of takes a similar approach. But I think that, if you're over relying on an AI for summaries and not doing that deep reading of scholarship or literature yourself, then you miss stuff that's in the middle, which is so important.
I like that very much. We need to be better readers than AI is. So thank you for that. Debbie, do you have any questions from the floor you'll read out for us, please?
Yes. One of our students has asked, there are so many AI research tools which exist and are coming online continuously. It may not be possible to endorse any particular tool. However, it would be helpful to know whether FGS has a hierarchy of quality AI tools versus others that are not trustworthy. For instance, is Research Rabbit a reputable tool, or should it be avoided?
So let's start by saying this is not going to be FGS endorsing a particular tool or set of tools, but I'm sure that our panelists have their own views and perhaps they could speak to that. Emily, maybe you'd like to start?
I don't think I have like a list of tools, but I can say the one that I still use most frequently is ChatGPT, just because it has all of my history of all my past conversations. And so when I say, do this, it can actually write things that are in my tone. It's remembered or knows enough about me to know that it can write emails, or when I ask it to edit emails, it writes them in, the similar tone that I use. And also there is a setting where you can turn off the data sharing so that your data, your conversations do not get added into, training future models. So I do have that privacy setting turned on. So ChatGPT is still the tool that I use the most, but I also use it with, prompt engineering techniques.
Mm-hmm. Gina, what about you?
My advice on this to students would just be use the oldest and most famous ones. And the reason for that is a lot of new hyped up AI tools are often just some fancy marketing on top of data being transmitted back to one of the older ones. So they'll have some kind of licensing agreement and they'll ultimately just be calling on ChatGPT or on Claude or on something. And all you're getting there is you're getting what you would have gotten anyway from the older models, but now your data is being filtered through some mysterious new thing that is doing who knows what with it for marketing purposes. I don't know about every possible thing. For example, I've not heard of Research Rabbit. I haven't used that, so I don't know, not commenting on that. But in general, with a new tech product, you have no idea what you're going to get, and you should think about it as a kind of evolutionary process where the things that last longer are the ones that have survived challenges. And so brand new stuff is very risky. But at this point, the incumbents in this market, which are 3 years old, things like ChatGPT and Claude, are just more reliable. I would use those, and I would hesitate to use anything else until it's been around for a few months and you've seen other researchers report back good results with that.
That's very good general advice. Thank you. Robin?
Thank you. Yeah, I do like SciSpace. I'll just put the link in the chat for kind of lit review purposes. The reason why I like it is because it draws from scholarly literature. So if you ask something like ChatGPT or Copilot to do that, it often pulls in a lot of just sort of random stuff from the internet, gray literature from who knows where. The nice thing about something like SciSpace, sort of dedicated, like research-oriented AI space sandbox, is that it will just focus on scholarly literature. That said, you still need to check to make sure, because I find that a lot of the time it doesn't do a great job of distinguishing between really solid, reputable journals and stuff that has been published in sort of more sort of predatory, unethical scholarly journals. And sometimes there are still mistakes. So you still do need to check in terms of like what it's pulling in. But it I think eliminates a lot of that sort of initial dross. I think as a general thing, I think I would agree with Gina and like don't just sort of jump on the latest bandwagon. But I also think there can be a lot of value in using a specific tool where it's available and reasonably well established, as opposed to a sort of general model like Copilot or ChatGPT, sort of, you know, in the same kind of way that you would use SciSpace for a lit review. Another one that I know of from my own sort of background in archival historical research is Transcribus, which is good for that uses AI for transcribing handwritten historical documents. So things like that can be useful. They have a more targeted data set. They've been trained really on that specific application. A lot of the time they've been developed by academics and researchers. So they have very trustworthy developers, institutional kind of backing, often really solid data security policies. And a lot of the time, I think they're also less environmentally costly because they're not throwing all the resources of something like ChatGPT, which is very big, at something that can conceivably be much smaller as a sort of energy cost. So those are things to think about. But then you have to be very sort of careful because you don't want to just get sort of swayed by the hype of something that's brand new but not actually established. I think that's a really good point.
Okay, good. So there's a nice spectrum here. We're pushing very close to the end of time. Debbie, do you have one last question for us?
Yes. This person says, I feel that students at university, undergrad and higher, are sheepish about being transparent about AI use, either informally in conversation or formally through citations. Is there a larger campaign, or should there be, to make AI use in academia feel like less of a stigma when its use is widespread?
All right, who wants to take that one away?
I'll say something. I mean, I think there has to be, because just descriptively, this technology is going to be used more and more and more. We're probably about 10 years from the point where most professional academics with PhDs who have teaching and research positions are just using this routinely. And once that happens, I mean, that's just the way it's going to be. And so if you have a black market where people are using it constantly but hiding the fact they're using it, that's actually worse than a kind of regulated intellectual market. And so I know some people listening to this don't like this idea, but I don't think it's stoppable at this point. And so it's better to develop norms for using this technology out in the open. So this is very hard to do. So finding a way to find the middle ground between like having this open discussion in this regulated intellectual market, but also the other bad thing is just seeming to grant students carte blanche to do whatever they want with the technology. That's a very hard medium point to find, but I think that's the only right answer. And the extremes where we try to avoid the technology entirely are just not realistic anymore. So that's my starting point.
I appreciate that middle ground. Emily?
Yeah, I just want to second exactly what Gina said. At least in my own courses, I, have it in the syllabus. Please use AI. Just tell me how you use it. Include this form that with all your assignments. Please use it, right? And I know that I've received course materials from previous instructors of the same course who had like a no AI use policy, right? So I agree that there are still people who are going to be against the idea, but I think it's inevitable. And so, there is that. We need to have a wider campaign about, just being like, yeah, like the decision tree, right? Be thoughtful, be mindful, be critical, but it will be widespread use in the future.
Robin, I'm going to put words in your mouth and guess that one way to lower stigma is to encourage people to join your community of practice. Would that be fair to say? Come at York, there's a really wonderful Gen AI pedagogies community of practice. I've attended some sessions. It's a thoughtful, interesting, very diverse group of people with very different views, approaches, roles at the university. So, Robin, I'm sorry, I'm going to use this last thing to push for your work and say that's one way to do it. The other thing I want to say as we're wrapping up is it's pretty clear to me that this needed to be either a double webinar or a 2-hour webinar. I had a lot more I wanted to ask you folks about what to do if your supervisor is very anxious or nervous about the use of AI. My students might want to ask you about that, how to deal with recalcitrant supervisors. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the environmental and intellectual property issues. There's a lot of big questions. So I hope maybe the three of you will consider coming back sometime if we want to have a follow-up. For all of you who are attending, the final slide was going to be a list of further resources. Debbie has thoughtfully put them in the chat instead. And if you're watching this later on YouTube, we will make sure they are provided there as well. There's lots to find out there about the guidance and the use of AI, but I'm just going to mention that the Ontario Council of Graduate Studies released a white paper that's very helpful in thinking through this. It includes even kind of prompts for having supervisor-supervisee discussions if you're thinking about that or if you're nervous about doing it. I want to thank our panel of experts so much. I quite literally could not have done this without you. I am very grateful for your time, your expertise, and the extent to which you were willing to entertain sort of all ranges of attitudes and spectrum of perspectives on this, and to give really practical, actionable advice to students who are curious about Gen AI. Thank you so much. For the rest of you, Scholarly Skills continues. This fall, we had one on intellectual property and one on use of archival research. You can look forward to questions like cultivating a growth mindset, getting through your academic milestones, and turning your academic CV into a professional resume in the new year. So do stay tuned, stay on our list, and look for all of our Scholarly Skills webinars on YouTube. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. Bye.